Okay, I apologize that I didn't send this out yesterday. I think on vacation I just lose track of what day of the week it is. So the end of last week's parasha and the beginning of this week's parasha discuss the tragic story of the Benot Midyan, of the Jews being ensnared by the daughters of Minyan, culminating in one of the leaders of the Shevet of Shimon, Zimri, sleeping with Kozbi Batsur, one of the princesses of Midyan. And the combination of this leads to a devastating plague, which, as we find out at the beginning of this week's parasha, almost led to the destruction of all of Klal Yisrael, because Hashem says in the beginning of this week's parasha that because of Pinchas' action, V'lo chiliti et bnei Yisrael b'kinati, that I didn't destroy the Jewish people in my jealousy and my wrath, which indicates that were it not for what Pinchas did, then all of Klal Yisrael would have been destroyed. And Pinchas, as we find out in last week's parasha, takes a stand for God and acts zealously on behalf of God and kills Zimri and Kozbi in the act, thereby ending the plague which already killed 24,000 people, and as we said, could have led to the destruction of Klal Yisrael entirely. What's fascinating is that this moment becomes paradigmatic for Chazal in terms of identifying sin and the cases in which the Jewish people deserve reward or punishment. And I've started preparing some of the Agadatot for next year, some in Bava Basra, but some also in Sota, which is what we're learning in afternoon Seder. And while I was going through this, I happened to come across a passage where the Yerushalmi in Tanit discusses cases in which the Jewish people did not have rain. And one city at some point becomes indignant that they are not getting rain, and they complain about it, and they complain that the merit of the local rabbis is not sufficient to warrant them getting rain. And the response found in the Yerushalmi is that Al v'amar kumehon Zimri echad haya bidaro v'naflu b'Yisrael chavdalet elef v'anu kama Zimri yesh bidarenu v'atem mitra'amin. In the time of Zimri, there was only one Zimri, and his sin led to 24,000 people being killed. And now we have so many Zimri among us, and yet you complain that we don't have rain. So what does this mean? So the Korban Eidah says that, in fact, in their time, there were many people who committed sexual sins. And therefore, this Gemara is not teaching us a universal lesson, except that just like in the case of Zimri, a public or really any sexual sin is particularly bad. And therefore, if this is happening, don't expect that God is going to withhold punishment. In fact, you should expect punishment. However, the Alik Tamar, Rabbi Yisachar Tamar, says that doesn't seem to be what's going on here. Because why of all sins would you identify Zimri? In the end of the day, these aren't the same. Zimri is one instance. And he says, therefore, that if you really want to understand why Chazal see the case of Zimri as paradigmatic, it's not because of the particular sin that he violated. And here he points to Agadata in Sota Daf Chav Bet, where the Agadata talks about different people who are hypocritical that should be avoided. And one of them are the people who are ma'asehen kema'aseh Zimri u'mivakshen schar kepinchas, are the people who act like Zimri but want the reward of Pinchas. And the Alei Tamar thinks that it's this moment, this understanding of Chazal that makes the story of Zimri and Pinchas so paradigmatic. Because as Chazal say, right, Zimri didn't just sin. Zimri approaches Moshe and says to him, am I allowed to be with Cosby? And he expects that Moshe will say no, but what he says back to Moshe is, well, if that's the case, then who allowed you to marry Tzipora, who's also from Midian? And he wraps up, therefore, his sexual sin in self-righteousness and says, in fact, I'm being a tzaddik. And it's not the sin itself that Chazal see as paradigmatic and particularly heinous, but what it is this attempt to present oneself as righteous even while really just giving in to one's base desires. And therefore, the Gemara says that it's specifically those people who are really Zimri, but they're pretending and they expect to be like Pinchas. That is particularly insidious. And therefore, Chazal see in this story the following paradigm, which is not just that if you sin, then you should expect to be punished, but rather, if you sin, and rather than either doing tshuva or at least acknowledging that you're weak, you make it into an ideology. You wrap it up and say, I'm righteous. You make it into a vision that this is the right thing to do, and therefore you don't even admit that this is weakness. And then you let it integrate so much into your psychology that then you become indignant when bad things happen to you. You become indignant when you're called out for it. You are doing Masa Zimri, but you want to be treated like Pinchas. That is the worst type of sin. And that's why it's being invoked in the Yerushalmi and Tanit. These people who were sinning, in whatever sin they were, and then became indignant that they weren't having rain because they failed even to acknowledge that they did anything wrong. That is the worst type of sin, because that's the sin that's most unlikely to be reversed, because it's wrapped up in self-righteousness and self-delusion. And therefore what Chazal seem to be teaching us is not just that sin is bad, but that the worst type of sin, the one that's the most destructive, is that which is carried out by people who insist on wrapping it up in self-righteousness, on creating an ideology around it, thereby making it almost impossible for them to ever do tshuva, because they fail to even understand they're doing something wrong. And when that ideology permeates their very being, not only do they deny that what they're doing is wrong, but they get to the point where they expect to be treated as tzaddikim, because eventually, when you turn your sin into an ideology, you get to the point where you think it's a mitzvah, where you think that you're justified, and more than justified, you think you're in the right, and therefore you will fail to do tshuva, because why would you do tshuva for doing the right thing? And that type of ideology, that type of self-delusion, is the most paradigmatic and most dangerous type of sin.